Well, hi everybody. Uh, I'm very pleased to host today two very distinguished speakers. And basically, this is the first of our Jean Monnet webinar series. My Jean Monnet chairship on security, migration, and society in Europe will organize some webinars throughout this month, June, and this is the first of this series. And basically, today we are honored by the presence of, as I said, two distinguished guest speakers. Professor Thomas Faist will give a talk to us. And then Professor Deniz Sert will discuss this presentation, and maybe she will have some other points and comments. And if we have some other questions, we will also do a Q&A session. So I will also, I would like to give you some brief information about the speakers. Thomas Faist is a professor of sociology of transnational migration development studies at Bielefeld University. His research interests focus on international migration, immigration integration, citizenship, social studies and development, social integration and development studies. So his latest book, and I'm sure this book will also inspire his presentation today, entitled as Transnationalized Social Question, Migration and Politics of Social Inequalities in the 21st century, published by Oxford University. Deniz Sert is another prominent scholar in her area of migration, and she's also Jean Monnet scholar, an associate professor at the Department of International Relations at Ozyegin University. She has published extensively on different issues such as international migration within Turkey and the surrounding regions. And she's also time to time writing short pieces in Turkish and appearing in media. So we can say that she's also a migration activist, if I may say in that form. Okay, now let me give the floor and microphone and camera under these conditions to Thomas. We are very looking forward to hearing your talk, Thomas, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Alper, for your kind words of introduction. And as I said before, I'm very excited about not only today's talk, the discussion, but also the Q&A session. I will use a PowerPoint presentation, so if it doesn't work, please let me know at once. Let me just see how I get there. Okay. Can you all see the PowerPoint? Okay, very good.
Yes.
As you can see, I changed the title a bit from the Transnationalized Social Question, it's so long, to a very short title, main title, Exit, a new agenda for migration research. And in doing so, I'd like to share some of the ideas of the book Alper just mentioned on the transnationalized social question. Now, my point of departure is a historical observation. Have we moved, so to speak, to put it very boldly, from communism and the proletariat to migration and migrants? In the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1848 wrote at the beginning of their manifesto, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter." Now, more than 150 years later, neo-Marxists Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, in their book on empire, wrote, "A specter haunts the world, and it is the specter of migration." Now, this leads me to the question, are migrants the new proletariat? Have we moved from the labor capital conflict to a migration conflict around the world? Have we moved from proletariat to migrants? And there is some, not evidence, but some hunch one can get from statistical data as to this observation. Here I present a table from Branko Milanovic, who used to be an economist at the World Bank. And he looked at what determines income levels around the world. And he compared income levels on an individual basis in the year 1870 and the year 2000, 130 years apart. And what explains income distribution, he says, are mainly two factors. As you can see, not everything is explained by these two factors, but that's what the data really points to. He says that in 1870, about half of the income variance was explained by class, whether or not you were a proletarian, a worker, or a capitalist, an employer. And only about 10 to 20% of the income variance was explained by the location, by the country you lived, by the citizenship you had. Now this kind of relationship turned around basically 130 years later. Nowadays, it's less class that explains the variance of income, but much more location, namely the country you live in and the citizenship you hold. And this is a kind of a striking reversal. Now, the statisticians among you will criticize this table I present, and for good reasons. So please only take it as a heuristic kind of insight. Now, what are the questions? Have we moved from voice, namely the voice of the working class, to the exit of migrants? Is that what has happened over the past 100 years? Has exit trumped voice? Have we moved from the exploitation of workers to the exclusion of migrants? Have we moved from class politics to cultural politics around multiculturalism, diversity? Have we moved from redistributive conflicts around income to recognition conflicts around age, gender, ethnicity, nationality, religion, all spurred by migration around the world? And more specifically, what are the implications for voice? What are the implications for the political cleavages we see emerging around migration? And so I'm not saying that migration is the new social question, so to speak, but that it's a lens to look at today's social question, as the conflict between labor and capital was a lens to look at the social question in the 19th century in regions of the world like Europe. Now, when I talk about the social question, I talk about the transnationalized social question. And social question is based on two dimensions: social inequalities and the politicization of social inequalities. Without social inequalities, materially in terms of income, without social inequalities in terms of that there are countries where there is civil war and others where there is not, without these differences, there would be not much migration, at least not to the level we see today. But what's very important is not simply the social inequalities in the world, but the politicization of social inequalities, the criticism of inequalities, such as naming injustices between groups, between migrants and non-migrants, for example. That makes up the social question. And I call it transnationalized because the social question is on the world scale, yes, but it also plays out in countries, on the country level in Turkey or Germany, in politics around immigration, or on the communal level when you have conflicts around accommodation of refugees, for example. Now, my argument today is to say that exit has not trumped voice. Exit has not replaced voice. And as we all remember, it was Albert Hirschman, who talked about exit and voice as kind of strategies which are exclusionary, but could also go together. And I would say in this case, they go together. In which ways? In two ways. Namely, that when in the 19th century, class was one of the main cleavage lines of political conflicts when workers demanded social rights, when that led to the establishment of early welfare states in some parts of the world. This kind of conflict has been complemented by conflicts around heterogeneities, differences, around ethnicity, religion, gender, citizenship, age. All of these have come up. Now, migration is not the only driver of, for example, age or gender becoming more dominant in addition to class. But it is one of the processes we experience today, which makes, for example, gender and religion, ethnicity, more and more important in the politics of immigration countries, but also emigration countries. And we see, and what I will talk about the big processes underlying these neoliberalism, individualization, risk society a bit later. But what's very important is also the second dimension, namely that migration is a particular kind of phenomenon, a particular animal, so to speak, namely in the sense that often in migration processes, we move from a politics regarding the economics or the humanitarian side to a politics of culture and recognition. Think of, for example, when we talk about labor migration, about the group called guest workers in the 1960s, hailing from Southeastern Europe, Turkey, North Africa, coming to Western Europe. At the beginning, it was mostly economic questions which stood at the center. So the unions in countries like Germany wanted to make sure the wages of native workers were not undercut. But take a snapshot 30 or 40 years later, when most of the debates were around religion. And this has to do with the fact that migrants never stay just labor migrants. They turn into citizens, or before they turn into citizens and while they turn into citizens, or they are active, politically engaged, actively socially engaged, quite a few of them. So this is a development we observe not only in regard to labor migration, but we could also talk about humanitarian migration. So exit complements voice, that's the argument. Exit has not replaced voice. That's what Branko Milanovic raised the question, and he argued, well, exit has replaced voice. I think it has not. Now, when we really take a historical view, and I think that's very important, we should identify some of the difference of the old social question in the 19th century and the new one in the 21st century. And forgive me, this is very crude what I'm doing here. But I think what's very important that we are first aware that nowadays, in many countries around the world, we have a welfare state or an emerging welfare state. That we did not have in the 19th century, the state regulating the risks emanating from labor force participation. Also, the functional equivalent of the welfare state in many states around the world, outside Europe, North America, Australia, are what's called national development states. States where socioeconomic development reigns large and where you also have welfare elements, of course, like pensions and other kinds of policies. Now, these policies call for more closed borders in order to protect the population inside from competition. It's kind of a protectionist, sometimes even nationalist development. Second difference we have between the 19th and 21st century is effective migration control. Nowadays, migration control is very effective. Think of Corona. Overnight, all over Europe, the borders simply closed. No problem to implement that. Nowadays, to go a bit further and deeper, we have processes of externalizing borders. So there is forward remote control of European countries in North Africa, in Mali, in Tunisia, in Algeria, in other countries where Europe exchanges border control for development money, so to speak. So we do have much more effective control nowadays. Then the third one is the increasing culturalization of politics. So we do have voice. The voice is not only related to class, although that is going on, still going on, but it's also related to recognition issues. As Nancy Fraser once termed it, kind of the complementarity of now redistributive issues around income and social services on the one hand, and recognition issues of cultural recognition on the other hand. And the fourth difference between the 19th and the 21st century is that in the 19th century, you had kind of dominant theories, not one dominant theory, but dominant theories coalescing around socialism, anarchism. Nowadays, that's totally expanded. You do have theories around against all kinds of oppressive structures, feminism, food sovereignty, religious movements which are political, and so on and so forth, which are theorized. So there is not one kind of dominant strand of theory underlying also the social movements around that. So these are four of the big differences, I think, between the 19th and the 21st century in terms of the social question. What I want to do now is to look at the puzzles around the politics of immigration and emigration in order to understand better the political cleavages which have formed around migration, immigration and emigration. And again, please exclude the very crude dichotomies I'm opening up. So I will first talk about the immigration puzzles and then about the emigration puzzles. And there are two axes, so to speak. The vertical axis is, are migrants economically wanted and or are they socioculturally welcome? Now, that is on the vertical. On the horizontal level is the immigration policies. Are they expansive or restrictive? Are the borders more open or are they more closed? And if you have this 2x2 table, you can look at the welfare puzzle in the first line and the liberal puzzle in the second line. Or you could also call it paradox, although it's not a logical paradox. So what's the welfare puzzle? The welfare puzzle is, or the dichotomy or the tension is between market liberalization and decommodification or regulated commodification. What do I mean by that? By market liberalization, meaning the kind of ideology and policy which says the market regulates it all, so to speak, if you push it to the limits. Migrants then are mostly regarded as human capital. Not really, that's the main part, a homo economicus. And that's really also underlies what we call the competition states, states competing with each other for labor, the competition for the best and brightest engineers or software developers from the Indian subcontinent, for example, to Europe. This stands against another kind of, and this makes for open policies, for open immigration policies. Get as many as you can, get the best and brightest, but also get everybody who wants to work for wages. That stands in contrast to a more restrictive stance exemplified by commodification of labor or decommodification of labor. Decommodification means that you have social rights. You can live even independently of a wage income or of a salary. Or that commodification that the workers are protected while they work. And so this kind of welfare state ideal, which you have here in the welfare state, this is expressed by the fact that labor markets, national labor markets, local labor markets need to be protected so that there's no undercutting, there's no wage dumping. But, and this is interesting, and I'll come back to that later, it also means that migrants get social rights. That's what I meant when I mentioned the German labor unions in the 1960s, who made sure that everybody got social rights, both natives and migrants. And this is a kind of a conflict going on, you can see. It's a kind of a conflict between two competing state principles, between the competition state and the welfare state. That's why I call it the welfare puzzle. And so they're contending principles, competing principles. The second set of competing, or the second competing principles is called the liberal puzzle. That's not my term, by James Holyfield, as you remember, from the 1990s. Saying, well, and I use different words, but what Holyfield is saying says, well, look, immigration states, you know, they really try to be sovereign and control their borders very effectively. Why? Because once people are inside the borders, inside the state, it's a liberal state, and certain rights human rights have to be granted to migrants. You cannot treat them at will. So in a way, the liberal puzzle has also expansive policies. That's kind of cultural pluralism. And the expansive policies are not so much regarding the immigration side, but the integration side. And on the other hand, you have a restrictive policy, restrictive immigration, restrictive integration, that's pushed by culturalization and securitization policies. So again, here we have two kind of state principles contending with each other, the rule of law and the national on the one hand, and the national democratic state on the other hand. So what does cultural pluralism mean? Well, it's based on the rights revolution emanating in the 1960s with movements like the civil rights movement, but also other movements, the environmental movement. And it means that everybody, but also migrants, should have not only human rights, but also cultural rights. Multiculturalism should be observed. And that there are humanitarian obligations towards refugees, which have to be heeded based on the human rights conventions most of the states signed. Now, this is in contrast and stands in stark contrast to a position which says, well, we have a right to curtail immigration, and we should restrict immigration very much because we want to maintain our national culture. Yes, we will even want to maintain our democracy. And that often leads to securitization, seeing migration as a security challenge and object, that migrants are perceived as risks and as a threat. Now, in principle, and this is not only a populist and right-wing populist position, this is also a deeply conservative position, right? And it's a position which is tied to the democratic nation state. The populist politics exploits that, saying, oh, the national state is a state which is not only owned by elites, by all of us, it's a democratic state. Well, whether or not that's just rhetoric, that's another question. But I think these two contending principles, the rule of law, which is expansive, multicultural on the one hand, and the national democratic state, which is sometimes portrayed as if national homogeneity is the rule of the day, contend each other. Now, these are the kind of the puzzles. You have these two contending principles, and I come later, what does that mean for political coalitions? Let me quickly go on to emigration puzzles. Here we have a similar set of tensions. In this case, it's the development puzzle and the national puzzle. On the vertical, you have, again, political economic processes and sociocultural processes. And on the horizontal, you have not restrictive and expansive immigration policies, but you have the understanding of the nation. Is it broad? Is it more a global nation, or narrow, the nation at home? And again, when you look at the development puzzle, the first puzzle, you have market liberalization. Here, immigrants are the carriers of human capital, and they provide remittances. We all know that, and it's been pushed by the World Bank. It's also a sign of the competition state. And against this is the national development state, and that means that economic development is based on national resources, that you should avoid brain drain, that you should avoid migrants leaving the country if the country is not compensated by the loss of physicians and nurses and others. It's the national development state. And what has changed over the years is that the national development state has been kind of undercut by neoliberal policies pushing not the national state, but the local state, pushing civil society, pushing the market. And in this kind of context, it was that migrants were portrayed as development agents and remittance providers. That was already a big topic in the 1960s, but in the context of the national development state. Nowadays, it's the context of market liberalization, and more responsibility is put on migrants to provide remittances, although remittances is usually private, although there are also collective remittances, of course. The second puzzle is the national puzzle. Here, you do have transnationalization going on, namely that some nation states and more around the world, be that Ghana, be that Russia, be that Turkey, these are all states which are also immigration states, of course. That they have a diaspora abroad, and then diaspora needs to be cared for, and the diaspora brings assets, not only remittances, but also investments. And this stands against what I call the transnational state, so to speak, stands against the national security state. Because there's also securitization on the emigration side going on, namely that immigrants and diasporas are considered dangerous to the state. I mean, there are, for example, the case of Sri Lanka, take that case, that the Tamil Tigers fought against the state, tried to erect their own state, and minorities who challenged the existing nation state. So the existing nation state then perceives these groups as risks and threat. And again, you have a tension between the transnational state, which pushes for a global nation, and the national security state, which pushes for a nation at home, which should not be challenged by the diaspora. Now, these are two sets of tensions again, or puzzles again. Now the question is, which I want to go into a bit in my last part, is what does that all mean? Well, when you look at the developments on the immigration side, one could get the idea that in terms of the kind of tensions and the political tensions, the kinds of efforts to exclude migrants from cultural recognition, there's almost a Protestant ethic, a revival of Max Weber's Protestant ethic. We exclude the low and non-performers who don't perform well in the market. You exclude those who are not politically liberal, and you reward those who perform well economically and espouse liberal attitudes. Just to give you an example, in countries like Germany, the integration question is never raised with respect to highly qualified workers from Western Europe or North America or Japan. The integration question is always raised with those who are employed in low-skilled positions, who are not necessarily low-skilled. That, in a way, is a class-based channeling. Those in high-class position, the recognition issues are less pronounced. It's those in high-class position who are advocates of the integration issues. If you think about the headscarf debates in Europe and similar issues. And that's on the immigration side. On the immigration side, you have a kind of, if you want to turn it into a biblical comparison from the New Testament, the Matthew effect. Well, that means that usually those who migrate are not the poorest. So the remittances also mostly go to those who are not the poorest. So it is, in a way, those who have will be given. Now, these are some of the effects, but one should not, and I'll come to that, these are mechanisms pushing for inequality, but of course there are also counter movements. But let me just say, well, what can we learn from these considerations before moving to political coalitions? As I argue, exit has not replaced but complemented voice. The kind of the puzzles I presented, the liberal puzzle, the welfare puzzle, and immigration context, the national puzzle and the development puzzle in the immigration context, they are a testimony to the fact that politics, that voice, are both on the side of migrants and non-migrants is very active. But, and that I want to emphasize in a moment, is that immigration politics makes very strange bedfellows. In that you do have, when you look at the side of open borders, you do have employers and market liberals on the same side as cultural pluralists. And you have the left welfare state defenders, the social protectionists, on the same side as cultural restrictionists, at least in principle. And let me just go into what does that mean for political coalitions. There seems to be, when you look at it, what I just mentioned, the market liberals and the cultural pluralists, they are really mostly for more open policies. And when you look at it, this kind of position you see nowadays in diversity policies, diversity management policies. Policies, of course, which not only aim at migrants, but at all kinds of minorities. Basically, everybody belongs then to a minority. So diversity is emphasized a lot in these policies. Not social rights so much, but diversity. So I think that's a reflection of this coalition of market liberals and cultural pluralists. Then there is also an interesting cross-coalition between the market liberal, a potential coalition between market liberals on the one hand and those who are more restrictive, which in a way sounds a bit strange. But you know, social inequalities are produced nowadays. When we look at statistical data, those countries which are most market liberal and most neoliberal also have the highest kind of social inequalities in terms of income, access to healthcare, but also very, very discriminatory effects on migrants and minorities. Now, the most interesting coalition, I think, is the following, namely between the welfare statists on the left, who push for decommodification, and the cultural pluralists embedded in the rule of law. And in a way, as I told you, this should not be a coalition that comes into existence, because the welfare statists are more restrictive and the cultural pluralists are more open. But I think there is a bridge between the two, namely that in terms of the welfare state, there are also those who not only push the rights of natives, but they also push the rights of migrants. And that kind of rights-oriented approach, I think, pushing for equalization, for more equality in terms of income, in terms of redistribution, in terms of recognition, is a distinct possibility. So in a way, it goes against the grain of what I've been arguing so far, but I think there's a bridge between these two contending principles. Let me conclude here for the time being in order to give Deniz a chance to comment. Instead of a conclusion, I would say that as social scientists working in migration research and working on exit and voice, working on issues like class and cultural politics and how they go together, I think it would be naive to assume that our results, what we achieve and our insights would go into public policies in an instrumental way. Often, or most often, results from migration research, and that's a finding overall in the social sciences, not only for the field of migration, are not so much important for devising exact policies, but much more important to legitimate policies which are decided upon by politicians. So what's left for us, right? I mean, if that's not the case, if instrumental policy making is very difficult and to get an impact, I think what we can provide is orientation and meaning in our interventions into the public sphere as experts, as advocates, and as public intellectuals, perhaps. And in this case, I think in terms of the social question, exit and voice, I think understanding the mechanisms of social inequalities and the politicization, understanding how voice comes about, and detailing these mechanisms is a good chance, I think, to provide orientation to public debates. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. You are just on time. It was very informative and inspiring talk for me. It triggered several questions. By the way, we have a very good cohort of audience. We nearly 40 people is attending to this webinar, and we want some comments and questions and interventions from them as well. Just to remind for the latecomers, this is the first webinar of Jean Monnet series in Altinbas University. And in this webinar, we are hosting two distinguished speakers of migration, let me say. And I would like to give the microphone to Deniz, Senol, Sert, for her comments, questions, interventions.
Thank you, Alper, John, for the opportunity. And thank you, Thomas, for an eye-opening presentation. I believe the perspective of defining migration as a lens for understanding, or as a transnationalized social question, can open many new venues of discussion in migration studies, especially now during our times of the new normal, however you want to define it. I mean, there are many different definitions that I'm following nowadays. I would like to open the discussion with several questions that came to my mind while listening to you, and also while reading your book. I have to admit I could only read the open access part so far. I will have our library purchase it once we get back to the campus. I don't know when that will happen. The first question is the question of remittances, which is usually the first thing that comes to people's minds when discussing migration and transnationalism. And this has been also a question that has been in my mind since the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, because in an article in IMF's Finance and Development, it was stated that COVID-19 pandemic is crippling the economies of all countries, but for many low-income and fragile states, the economic shock will be magnified by the loss of remittances. Yet in early May, the Mexican president, I'm sure you followed it as well, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, acknowledged Mexican immigrants abroad for sending record remittances in this difficult period. He even called them as heroes. How can we relate this to your discussion of voice and exit complementing each other rather than being, alternatives? That's one point that I had. And the second issue that came to my mind is, as you also state in the introduction of your book, the book is largely focuses on south-north migration. I mean, I know you don't like these binaries as well, but I mean, they are useful for discussion. But especially for those new students in migration studies, what can be the new venues of research with regard to south-south or north-north migration? How can we situate the debate there? I'm asking this given the context that we are living in Turkey, which is largely becoming a destination of south-south migration. In a very short period of time, Turkey has become the host of the largest refugee community of the world. And third, and on a related point, especially given the new situation, as you stated yourself, I mean, it was very easy. Suddenly the entire borders were closed. And this also had a big effect for the students in the field as well. What would you advise to the students of migration studies, especially those who are interested in transnational research design? I mean, I'm mostly talking about those who are in their early stages of research. What would you advise to them in terms of fieldwork, data collection in this new normal? And another point that I had in mind was, you have hinted at this in your talk. But what can be said about the gender aspect of this discussion? When I say gender, I do not only mean feminization of migration, which is usually defined as increasing number of women in migration, but overall, do you think a gender lens would add to this discussion? Or the question can also be asked in relation to identities in general? Of course, what I have in mind currently is the uprisings in the US, taking us back to the question, is the social question only about class? Or is it really old and new? I mean, because I will go to my next point, which is the final point. In the book, you have a section entitled "The Future as the Present," and ask the question, is there an alternative? Well, maybe the present is also the past. So, I mean, would you mind commenting on that? And is there an alternative? I mean, especially at times where cosmopolitanism on the one hand and communitarianism on the other hand are in constant struggle with each other. I mean, at the end of your talk, you have mentioned that as social scientists, we don't have much room of maneuver in affecting policy, but maybe we can do more activism. I mean, in the global North context, it might be easy, but for example, based on my personal experience, given the fact that I'm in the global South, where I cannot voice that easily. What can be my role as a social scientist? Can I really serve an alternative here? So these are the major points that I had in mind. I'm sure we have many attendees who have more questions that will come up.
Okay, Thomas, would you prefer first respond to that, and then maybe we can take some other comments or questions if there are any?
Yeah, well, just very quickly, I mean, thanks a lot, Deniz, for these challenging questions, and I will not attempt to go into all of them. I think there are lots of food for thought, and in order to allow time for discussion, I keep very brief, right? When you say remittances, well, how does that connect to exit and voice? I think that remittances is a very good example you raise, because when you look at migrants who leave their country to settle somewhere else for a while or permanently, when they get together, when these migrants band together to improve the situation in the commune where they come from, in the town or village or city, they often form associations, hometown associations, let's say, and they intervene into the hometown affairs. So exit is kind of a prerequisite for that kind of voice, which they can exert via remittances. And of course, that creates also conflicts. It does not only create hospitals and streets and new school buildings, it also creates conflicts and who can decide, right? So I think that's one example of exit and voice. And when you look at refugees, for refugees to exert voice, again, staying in a safe country is an absolute prerequisite. So I think there are examples of how exit in a way is sometimes a precursor of voice, and not exit just an option which you take once voice is not possible anymore. That's also the case, but we have to look both ways. That would be my argument. When you say south-south, north-north migration, I think that's exciting. And I often wonder, you know, if north-north migration is north-north migration. When you look at the migration of Romanian workers in the slaughterhouses and meatpacking industry in Germany, they're European citizens, EU citizens, who should be treated the same as German citizens, right? We're not talking about third country citizens, we're just talking about, let's say, Romanian citizens. Well, is that really, at the surface, it looks like north-north, but if you dig deeper, it's more like a south-north constellation in terms of how these workers are employed by subcontractors, and not illegally, but in gray zones. And certain sectors like the construction industry only work because they are gray zones, right? So I think that south-south, north-north migration more attention should be devoted to it than I did in the book. But I also think that one needs to dig deeper to see what are the power inequalities. And it's not so north-north anymore often, right? Although that can be the case. The gender aspect, I think, is very crucial in terms of how how voice plays out. In terms of in my work in the book, I talk about how, for example, gender is thematized in a way to say, oh, a certain group of migrants is traditional and backward. So a certain category, in this case, let's say women wearing headscarves, are outdated, and so on and so forth. But the interesting question then is, whatever position you take, is what about the agency of those who are talked about? And there, I think gender is a very good example of how it intersects with class, with ethnicity, with religion. And the whole intersectionality debate is a good example of that. And the last question you raised, I wish I had an answer when you ask about how should social scientists intervene. All I can do is, or all I've done also in the book, is to say, well, we can distinguish certain roles social scientists can have in the public, right? And maybe I can just share a slide for a moment on that. And hope I'll be there in a minute. Here, that there are different types of intervention. If you look at the second column, the type of intervention. Sometimes we act as experts and we serve on national expert councils on migration. And I'm sure that's also the case in Turkey, where scholars are asked in councils and advisory bodies, right?
Yeah,
but that's
I mean,
what I say.
There's a difference there, though. I mean, for you to be a national expert council, I mean, on councils, how can I say? You have to be, you cannot voice if you want to be on those councils. That's what I was going to say.
Okay. No, I mean, there are stark differences between the countries. And also, I mean, in a country like Germany, if you descend too far from the mainstream, you also will never be appointed to the National Expert Council. But that's different from what you're describing. I see that. And what I want to point out is that the expert is a very different role. And sometimes we play the role of experts. And we try to do that. And when we're asked to do so and we think it makes a difference. But often I think we also serve as advocates, that we say we need to reform policies. Think of the climate refugees, our Dutch colleagues, some of the Dutch colleagues who say we need to bring in climate refugees into the Geneva Convention and we need to do this and that. Whether or not that's a good idea, that's another matter. But being advocates of migrants, which raises the question, of course, isn't that a patriarchal role we're playing? Isn't that really a role denigrating migrants and overlooking their agency? And the third role, I think that's usually only limited to certain kinds of people who are well known in the public, like Naomi Klein in Canada, right? Or Jürgen Habermas in Germany, or the all ubiquitous Slavoj Žižek, who talks about everything, but also about migration. And that's a different role, right? It's a different role, I mean, reflecting, being a critic, being a utopian, for example. Whereas the advocates want social change. And when we're experts, we say, okay, yeah, let's devise better policies. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but we should be aware what kind of role we're playing. But that's just for a start, of course. And your question contains many more elements which I cannot go into. Thank you for the comments and the questions, which I heed for another version, for the German version of the book.
Thank you.
That's great. Yeah, before just going through the comments and questions of the audience, to abuse my position, and I would like to just raise a question. Actually, both of you may respond to that if you wish. The Hard and Negri's book, to which Thomas made reference, was also saying that the exception has become the norm. And this is a typical standard position, particularly on the left now. So basically, the state of exception or the exceptional has become the norm, which is often defined as the suspension of rule of law. And they also, in the same book, explain the current international politics as a kind of global civil war within a same empire, actually. From that point, I want to come to a legality and also, international law on migration. Because we know that particularly from the mid of 20th century, there are some international treaties, both on human rights in general and also on migration in particular, like Geneva Convention. So I wonder, what do you think about the possible and potential roles and impacts of international law on the amelioration of migrants through a right-based approach? I mean, is international law declining in this area as well? Is international law suspended? So is the exception becoming the norm, or can we still hope, from something from international law on migration and human rights?
Should I go first, or you want to go first, Deniz?
No, please go ahead.
I think that the more the exception becomes the norm, as Hard and Negri put it, the more important international law becomes. Because when we look at the refugee camps on the Greek islands, that's one of the examples which are overcrowded, where there is no chance to move on and to get a fair or perhaps a speedy or procedure in order to be recognized or not recognized as a refugee. I think the more we have situations like that, the more international conventions and international law serve as guideposts. And the more countries also like Germany or even Sweden, only give very limited subsidiary protection to refugees. The more that takes place, the more we really need to look at international law. And I think that we constantly need to push that limit and also look at those international norms which cannot be put into practice very easily. The Geneva Convention, many countries have signed. Well, not all adhere to it, as we know. But there's also a recognition in other parts of the world, and it was in Africa in the 1960s, in Latin America in the 1980s, in Africa with the Organization of African Union, and later on the Kampala Convention, in Latin America, the Cartagena Declaration, which said, well, there's not only persecution. We should not only look at people who are persecuted, we should also look at people who are victims of generalized violence and civil war. Now that cannot be, and countries over the past decades have taken that up in addition to the Geneva Convention and said, we grant some protection to people who flee war, for example, Syria or Afghanistan. So in a way, over the past decades, it's not only, there are contradictory trends. Namely, on the one hand, the responsibility to protect has been expanded on the criteria which are used to grant protection. On the other hand, fewer and fewer people are granted permanent protection. So these are contradictory trends. And I think international law has to do with it, or the usage of international law, in that international law has been broken, but it also has introduced new elements, has added impetus to the policies. So I don't see it that all refugees are now homo sacer, that the state of exception is the only game in town. I think it's an increasing element of the game in town, of the homo sacer and the state of exception. But we should not forget that there are also tendencies to consider more grounds for granting protection. So I think it's contradictory. The process is contradictory.
But you are more optimistic than being a pessimistic.
Yes, I'm more optimistic. I mean, which sounds strange. Yes.
Yeah, but it sounds good as well. Deniz hocam, do you have any response to that?
When you asked the question, the immediate thing that came to my mind were the global compacts that were signed in December 2018. Well, I know they're not legally binding, but they also show us where the states are in terms of their look on this whole migration phenomenon. And I mean, from that side, I think they also show very well what Thomas was referring to in his presentation in terms of the paradoxes, because they are not really looking at migrants as homo sacer, but what they are doing is they're trying to involve the migrants. I mean, if you look at the Global Compact on Migration, for example, what does it say? It says, hey, migrants, go abroad, work hard, make remittances, send them back home, help your home get more developed, right? I mean, even the burden of development is on the migrant, if you look at those texts. So I think, I mean, I'm not trying to be pessimistic here, but I think the global compacts in particular shows us how the states are seeing the whole issue. And it is really like showing us how the whole thing is becoming more and more neoliberalized, which is also gives reference to, I think, Thomas's paradoxes that he underlined in his presentation as well.
Yeah, for those who may not be familiar with the Agambenian terminology, maybe we should define bare life or homo sacer. Homo sacer is bare life. Basically, he means, he uses this term for people who don't have anything. I mean, any legal protection, any economic future, any social protection, so on and so forth, any political rights. So they're all sort of, they don't have all of these. So this is defined as bare life. And yes, as you mentioned, basically some of us lives could be likened to Agamben, to bare life, actually. Okay, I think we have a question. Esra, by the way, is with me, and maybe she can read out this question for us.
Yeah, by the way, you can also see it in the Q&A section of the screen. The first one is by Pınar Sarıgöl. She is asking how, Thomas, you define the normative position, whether political or ideological, attitude of transnationalism, how transnationalism is related to critical theory, and or which branch of critical theory?
Okay, well, I do think that transnationalism can be related to a variety of theories, and among them critical theory, I think. You can relate it, first of all, if you put it in a macro scale, in a macro context, to the old, kind of old-fashioned almost, dependency theories or world systems theories, which I think is an important element of the whole setup. Critical theory, I think, comes in when we look at transnational migration and processes of transnationalization more generally. When we talk about inequalities and the mechanisms fighting against inequalities. Here, I think critical theory is, of course, a kind of an Enlightenment theory, which which looks at the ideals of the Enlightenment, so to speak, the ideals also of the political revolutions following the Enlightenment, like the French Revolution, and then really asking how come that these ideals of increasing equality, and also, for example, in terms of recognitions, have not turned out as they have supposed to be. And this, I think, where critical theory comes in, and where I totally agree to bring in critical theory much more into transnational analysis. And I think critical theory is, for example, visible nowadays in the theories of intersectionality, when we ask how class, gender, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, and perhaps other and religion and other kinds of differences make a difference, not only in terms of exclusion, but also in terms of inclusion. So I think there is still a role, a much increased role, much more prominent role of critical theory in transnational analysis. So far, the bigger theories alluded to by transnational migration scholarship have been world systems theories, for example. But I think critical theory overall is very important if you understand the relationship of exit and voice, class, and culture.
Yeah, if we think that migration also triggering social inequality more and more, and together with some other factors, I think we really need this lens of critical theory in the Frankfurtian sense as well. I think in a Marxian sense as well. I think we have some other questions. Maybe it's better to have them together and so go through them together and respond to them. Yeah.
The first one is a more general question. There is no end to immigration. When do you think immigration will deserve a global attention? And there's a more specific question which says, how do you situate return migration in immigration puzzle?
And
Okay.
I think there is one more, Esra Hocam, the puzzle, how countries fit into this matrix.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Do you want me to read it? How countries fit into this matrix, I don't think they distinct so clearly on these terms, as Yilmaz asked.
Okay, you want me, perhaps I'll start with the last question, how the countries fit into this matrix. I think I'm not talking, when I talk about these two matrices, immigration puzzles and emigration puzzles, I don't want to create the idea that immigration puzzles are only relate to strict immigration countries, because many countries are both immigration and emigration countries. So I think these puzzles can play, both the immigration and the emigration puzzles can play in one and the same country, if you take a country like Turkey, because Turkey is both an emigration and a very important and increasingly important immigration country. So the matrices are analytical tools to separate, to identify what to look for. They are not really descriptions of real type countries. For example, the liberal puzzle is something which relates to all those countries where you find a certain rule of law and securitization. And I think that's true not only for European countries, that's true for many other countries. And you also have, when you look at the emigration side, if you look at the global nation idea, it's not only countries in what's called the global south which have an idea of a global nation. There are also other countries on the face of the earth which really try to cater to their citizens abroad. Take France and Belgium, for example, who even have social health insurance for their immigrants abroad. So in a way, or state social health insurance, state health insurance. So what I mean is that I'm not saying that, for example, Germany only belongs to the immigration puzzle, or Turkey would only belong to the immigration puzzle. It's a bit more complicated than that. But because it's kind of, these issues are going back and forth, I think it's important to simply separate immigration and emigration as analytical kind of concepts. I don't know if that makes sense. It's meant as a heuristic which operates with concepts which are more like ideal types, not with real type countries and not real type issues. The return migration is a very good question. I think in one way, I would say that in certain respects, like political opposition, return migration can be an issue very similar to diaspora politics. Because as we know from empirical studies, let's say from Mexican migrants who lived in the USA, returned to Mexico, they're the ones, or some of them are politically, have changed somewhat their opinion, have changed their outlook. And so they could be regarded more like an opposition within the country in some cases. So return migration has to fit into the picture. And it, I think, is an issue which I didn't treat here separately, but could fit into the whole issue of diaspora politics. And the return migration is also an important issue because it links to the remittance issue, not sending remittances anymore, but perhaps engaging in investments or remitting not only money, but what you can remit when you return to another country or the country of origin. You can return ideas, you can return certain ideologies, ideas about how democracy should work, for example. That I think is important. So return, I think, is something which needs more consideration. But that's something which has been a problem for migration research now for decades, that emigration and immigration are really talked about and analyzed a lot, whereas there is not as much attention to return migration. And that has to do with a very skewed distribution of also resources to engage in this kind of research.
Deniz Hocam, would you have any comment?
No, I think with regard to the question on the states, I think we have already talked about it when we also mentioned the international law. I mean, how countries fit into this matrix. And I also agree that they don't distinct so clearly on these terms. I mean, in his presentation, Thomas has mentioned about externalization, for example. I mean, the countries are not even bounded with their own physical borders anymore, but they're externalizing their border security to other countries. And also, I mean, I agree, and I'm also working on a paper now for, I don't know if she's here, but Didem's upcoming book. And countries are learning from each other very fast as well. For example, Turkey is learning very fast from the European counterparts in terms of externalization, because we know that Turkey is also getting more engaged with such policies, signing more readmission agreements with source countries, paying more attention to the security, airport security in other countries such as Nigeria, Afghanistan, etc. So, I mean, the states are definitely there. And I also see that the states are maybe not more on the right side, but the states have also begun to understand that the migrants have an agency. But the way they are seeing this is not from a rights perspective, but more of a agency in terms of capital. As Thomas has mentioned, it is more related to migrants being human capital, which is also, again, fitting into this neoliberal agenda that the states have.
Yeah, when you talk about the externalization, the first institution coming to my mind is the European Union. The EU has a clear and a externalization policy since years and years, and Turkey maybe learned from the EU in that sense. Turkey's externalization policies have been Europeanized, maybe we can put it at that way, but not necessarily in a very normative and positive way, I think. Do we have any other question or comments?
One more. Do countries like Russia and Iran use migration as a political tool?
Yeah, that's a good question, because this may be translated into Turkey as well. When we look at Turkish foreign policy, which is tamed by overdose of populism as well, we witnessed that, especially after the European migration crisis of 2015. Turkey is also using this sort of weapon, I mean, in quotes. We have witnessed that in several cases in Turkey. Politicians, and especially the current president, threatened Europe just to open the borders, implying that all Syrians will go to Europe, so on and so forth. And once he also did this, So can we say that, I mean, if we just a bit broaden the context of the question, can we say that some countries tend also to use migration issue as a sort of weapon or leverage to seek their own national interests?
Well, I think that some countries do use the control, or try to control their citizens or their former citizens who are living abroad, especially if these citizens form associations who are oppositional to the regime. And that's clearly the case in a country like Russia, like Iran, for example. Think of Iran trying to control the Mujahideen abroad, even in countries like Germany. And that, I think, is one of the, is kind of an extension. It's also an externalization, in this case, of internal politics, of domestic politics. The externalization of this conflict between opposition and regime. And I think part of that kind of development is visible in the fact that Russia, along not only Turkey or Ghana or other countries, but also Russia, has come up with an agency, a national agency, to cooperate with the diaspora abroad. But I think that's one element. But we should never forget that even states like Russia or Iran are not, their diaspora policies are not only geared to control the opposition abroad. I think that's one element. But the other element always is to tap into the resources, I mean, of the immigrants abroad. I mean, to use them as ambassadors of Russian or Iranian or Ghanaian or Turkish affairs, right? To use them to engage in a sort of a soft diplomacy, or public diplomacy. And that seems to be the buzzword. So there is not only kind of rigorous coercion, which could use even means like murder or assassination, but there's also the element of soft and public diplomacy, where many countries, and even those who really oppress their citizens abroad, try to tap into. And there are also mixed cases of, think of a country like Eritrea, which is very authoritarian and dictatorship oriented, trying to tax citizens abroad, the healing tax, as we know. But that kind of taxing only works if the citizens living abroad do have some trust in their government in the country of origin. So I would say, yes, Russia and Iran are using diaspora policies to control or even oppress citizens abroad, while at the same time, oppression is usually not the only instrument in the arsenal of these governments. They have a kind of a soft side as well. So I think it's dualistic. It's even contradictory at times. And that also is seen in the exhortations. Alper, you mentioned President Erdogan. When he talks to the Turkish diaspora abroad, let's say in Germany. And there are very interesting kinds of statements like, he exhorts Turkish citizens abroad to integrate, but not to assimilate, right? And these are all policies where you don't have a very, very clear-cut tendency. The only clear-cut tendency is to control. But the means of control, they shift, and one has to pay particular attention to shifting means of control.
I would also like to add, I think in such countries, I mean, including Turkey, migration also gives the states a great agenda setting power. I think that's exactly what we see in the context of President Erdogan's speeches. I mean, that's what we observed in what happened at the end of February in Turkey along the Edirne border as well. That migration card is always there for them to, like change the agenda overnight in the eyes of the public sphere. So it is not only about international politics, but it's also becoming an important tool for domestic politics as well. I mean, it's also a big power as well.
Yes, that's right. But in Turkish context, I think there's one important difference when we consider the populist regimes. When you reflect on the populist regimes in Europe, for instance, especially, the right-wing parties and populist governments, they're against migration, right? But in Turkey, there's more complicated situation in that sense. I mean, there's a populist regime, yes, but it is at least at the discursive level, it's not against so much migration. It does not devise fully anti-migration arguments, but the opposition, the main opposition party, CHP, Republican People's Party, in that sense, is using more anti-migration argumentative traits. So this is an interesting point. And another point that I want to add to Thomas's, that Thomas, you talked about the diaspora politics. As another similarity between populist regimes, I think they really would like to mobilize their diaspora. I think Modi, for instance, of India, has also a very systemic and well-funded program of mobilizing Indian diaspora in different countries for consolidation of his own constituency. So, I mean, regarding the migration issue, the domestic and the foreign distinction is also blurring. Is there any question or comment? Maybe one final.
How do you evaluate the origin and transit countries' intention for their own agenda to be taken into account while coming to terms with destination countries?
Yeah, I think we already a bit gave answers to that question, but if you have, Thomas and Deniz, if you have some final comments, just let me take that, and then we can, I think, close the session.
Yeah, perhaps just to the last question raised, the interests or the position of the transit countries. I think when looking at the transit countries and the countries of origin, one should never forget the power of civil society in these countries. Take the example of Mali. When the European Union demanded of Mali to take back rejected asylum seekers and to engage and help European countries in the what's called repatriation, or even voluntary or semi-voluntary repatriation, or not so voluntary repatriation. Then it was the coalition of civil society groups in Mali which forced the government not to sign the agreement with the European Union. So to put a stark stand, at least in this case, in the case of some West African countries and North African countries, my hunch is that the origin and transit country governments are not necessarily the only ones, to oppose the policies by the European Union. Quite to the contrary, some of these governments have good reason to cooperate, because externalization of migration control policies is always tied to development cooperation funds. That's also true for South Sudan. And whenever I talk to politicians about this, they say, yeah, Faist, your criticism may be valid, but who should we talk to when we engage in migration politics? I mean, tell us. Well, I don't have a good answer for that, but I do think that the civil society organizations in the countries themselves are one of the hopes we have to oppose some of the most negative consequences of these externalization policies. Because the externalization policies, from my point of view, above all lead to the fact that migration becomes more dangerous and becomes more problematic for all involved, for the migrants, for the security forces, not for the European countries, but for all the origin and then the transit countries. And the transit countries then end up with, if externalization policies is really carried out and carried through to the end up being destination countries. And so time becomes a factor. So I do think that my hope when it comes to transit and origin countries would not be the sometimes very authoritarian governments. That's a contentious claim to make, but let me stop with that.
Well, Deniz, do you have any comment on that?
No, I don't have much to add, but there was one more comment that I could see, and I think it might be related. He asked, when Erdogan used the card of migration that I mentioned, majority of those on the Greek borders were non-Syrian refugees. What is its significance? It is true, majority of those people who were along the Edirne border were Afghans. And I think this takes us back to this question of transit, because what we can assume from this, although we don't have the exact numbers from this, is that for a majority of Syrians staying in Turkey, or they have something to lose. They had at least something to lose if they made it to that border, because they have been living here for now almost 10 years. They have established a life. I'm not saying it's a perfect life. Nothing is perfect, we know, but they had a lot to lose. But with the Afghans, we also have to understand there is a hierarchy of people. Also, there are inequalities also among those people who are seeking international protection in this country. And Afghans are in the lowest cadre of that group. So that's why they made it mostly to the border in late February, early March. And this tells us that for them, for the Afghans, Turkey is still a transit country. But for the others, it has become a destination. So it also shows how these distinctions, binary distinctions, are not helping us when we go into the real life situations. They are helping as theoretical. They're as tools for research. But when you are on the field, it is very complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, indeed, and this goes same for all kinds of research.
Yes.
But sometimes, binary distinctions could help as analytical categories, as we said, for instance, as we constructed between the norm and the exception. Well, okay, it
There
was
is
a very...
question, I think, Alper, on the Jewish and Armenian diaspora,
Yeah,
if we have time.
yeah, of course.
Okay, well, I think that's a good question. You know, what about the significance of the Jewish and the Armenian diaspora?
Mhm.
I mean, definitely the Jewish diaspora in the United States, for example, has been very successful. Basically, the State of Israel was founded by the Jewish community in New York, right?
Mhm.
So in a way, you could say these diasporas have been very effective in lots of ways. And what I think is very interesting are two things. The first one is that there is policy learning from these diasporas. For example, when you look at the Jewish diaspora in the United States, you can see that there's not only the Jewish diaspora nowadays trying to impact policymakers in Washington, but also the diaspora groups from Arab countries. And they have made great strides in really increasing their presence and their influence. So in a way, I think that there are quite a few diasporas around the world trying to model their activities along the Jewish and the Armenian diaspora. The second point I would like to add is, well, when we always talk about the Jewish diaspora as a kind of a prime example of a diaspora. And it all goes back to the experience of the Jewish diaspora after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Now, what I've learned over the years is that that's not the only uncontested understanding, even of the Jewish diaspora. There's also a Jewish diaspora in the world who couldn't care less about the state of Israel. Now, that's not my position, but the Jewish diaspora in the sense who says diaspora are all those Jews living around the world, and Israel is not the congregating point. Again, this is not a political statement I'm making. I'm just saying diaspora can, even in the Jewish case, can have many different meanings, and there is no clear-cut meaning. And what we hear on the news in terms of the Jewish diaspora being so instrumental in US-American politics is only one side. There are other sides of the Jewish diaspora which are very different and which would heavily contest that kind of activity. So diaspora is not only usually a term used by political elites abroad or political elites used in the country of origin to nationalize political sentiment or even to carry out nationalistic projects. It can also be a kind of a project which is geared towards religious kind of community or kind of philosophical stance. So I would say we also need to broaden our horizon when we talk about diaspora.
Yeah, it seems there are really lots of interesting avenues for research. Yeah, but questions are coming, coming actually. There's one question, maybe we can close the session with that one. Nowadays, we also talk about state capacity. You know, especially in this process of COVID-19 pandemic, state capacity has been one of the top issues because some states, some European states and United States as well, they couldn't well respond to this pandemic, and they couldn't indicate any real manifestation of state capacity to fight this pandemic. So is there any relationship between state capacity and migration, or how can states deal with migration you know, in relation to their capacities? Does it make any difference, do you think?
Well, Deniz, would you like to start or should I start?
Well, of course, it depends on how we measure state capacity. What will be the level of measurement here? But if we are referring to its ability to make effectively implement decisions, and if the decision is to, for example, lowering migration numbers in a given country, well, there is no end to migration. And I think what we see is that, or what the research is showing, most of the time, the results of the decisions that the states are making are actually ending up with the reverse policy implications. Hein de Haas, for example, has this wonderful research about Moroccan migration to Spain. We knew that for years, this migration has been very circular, but as Spain, for example, increased its state capacity to control this migration, we have begun to see more and more permanent Moroccan migration in Spain. So increased controls or increased state capacity in that area led to more permanent migration, which is actually, in fact, something that states wouldn't want in the long term. So that's why we have to be very careful in how we are measuring the state capacity and the aim, and we have to define what is the aim. I mean, for example, COVID-19, yes, the states showed the great capacity of closing the borders, but then they are also now complaining in the sense that who will go and collect the harvest in the fields, right? I mean, that's an issue that many European countries are nowadays discussing. So we have to be very careful in the policy or the results of the policy that the state capacity is going to be used for.
Yeah, I agree totally, Deniz, with your point about the unintended consequences of state policies in that state policies, let's say, with respect to regularization of the illegal status of immigrants can have very deleterious effects. And also would say, well, state capacity, what is the aim of state capacity, right? In the sense that, is it border control? When it's border control, state capacity is a mixed kind of bag. It's a bag of fleas even, because we know that those states which managed to close their borders, and there's a book called Closed Borders talking about the communist regimes in the Eastern Bloc in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, were not the ones who were very effective in basically controlling these borders forever. Closed borders presuppose a sort of a police state. And you can have a lot of state capacity to build up closed borders, erect a sort of a police state when the rule of law is gone. And I think that's the real issue here. The real issue here is when we apply this thought to the European border regime at this point in time, it is very clear that we are moving towards an understanding, or that state capacity is used to ward off what's perceived as a threat without thinking of the consequences. For example, when EU President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, traveled to Greece a couple of weeks ago, she promised the Greek government money, 700 million euro, to control the physical border. There was no talk of money for resettling migrants, which is a contentious issue in the EU anyway. And so state capacity, in a way, it's easy to show state strength when you physically control borders. That's also what Deniz pointed to, right, in the Corona example. But it's quite another thing if you think of state capacity as the capacity to adhere to international norms, to international conventions you have signed, in being able to resettle people or to repatriate people. I think these are much more thorny issues. And in that respect, I think there are some elements of a police state now in the European Union border control regime. The EU itself is not a police state, but there are elements of that. And I think that shows some state capacity, but only state capacity at physical control, and no state capacity at redistributing what's called the burden, if it's a burden at all, the costs of settling and resettling refugees. So in that respect, I think state capacity has to be defined. Now that's the first. And the second element would be the integration capacity of states. That refers to really the fact that are there sharp boundaries between migrant groups and non-migrant groups, and who belongs to the other? Who is the object of othering? And so are states capable, for example, of decategorizing discriminated groups? Like Germany tried with this notion of persons with migration background, but that didn't work completely. It was an effort, it was a good effort, but it really didn't work because nowadays politicians, when they mention persons with migration background, everybody knows that these are minorities, right? So you cannot just decategorize. There are also limits to state capacity. But I think these are the very interesting realms of state capacity, which are much more difficult for the state to deal with than physical border control.
Well, very good discussion. I quite liked it. Thank you very much to both. That was a really good webinar, I think, and I was a bit excited at the beginning. So it's the first time that I'm experiencing as a moderator for a webinar, but I think it went well. And I also would like to thank to our audience. They raised really very good questions, I think, and which made substantial contributions to the development of our discussion here. And I would like to just close the session here. Both Thomas and Deniz, thank you very much again. If you don't have any final word, I would like to close the session.
Well, thanks for having us, Alper.
Thank you, Alper. This was great.
Yeah, thank you very much for speaking to us, attending to the webinar. Okay, just before finishing, I have an announcement. Next week, but this time Wednesday, on the 10th of June, I will be hosting two distinguished speakers as well. And one of them will be Thomas Diaz from Tübingen University, and he will be talking about security, justice in the EU and global climate change policy. So Dr. Ümit Şahin from Sabancı University Istanbul Policy Center will act as a discussant. He's also a climate activist. So next week we will talk about the security and justice matters in relation to global climate change. And I hope this audience will attend to this webinar as well. So thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.
Goodbye.